Thank you very much. This session is between the chair and keyboard, right? When I was a wee hacker on the internet for the first time, that was one of the first things I learned, right? The problem exists between the chair and the keyboard, PEPCAK. I want to explore that today. My name is Wolfgang Goerlich. I'm an advisory CISO with Cisco Secure, working with Duo. Now, you probably saw that the Verizon data breach report came out last week. Very exciting. I am always very thrilled to see what Verizon puts out. I like to joke that it's one of the major holidays at my house. We all get together and we have a good time. We open up the Verizon data breach report and we see what it says. And no surprise, given if you paid attention for the past 14 years of these reports, no surprise, what we found was 85% of the breaches involved a human element. 85%. Now, I can't help but think of that number and think of something I read in the book of Design of Everyday Things. This is Don Norman's book, not an IT book, a design book. And he made the observation that most industrial accidents are caused by human error. And the estimates range from 75 to 95%. So he asked, how is it so many people can be incompetent? And I was thrilled. I'm like, yes, tell me, how is it? Because this is what we see in security again and again. 75 to 95% of breaches are caused by the people. So I flipped to the next page. And they're like, they aren't. It's a design problem. I was like, Don Norman, no, you can't be telling me that it's me. I believe I fight for the user, right? I believe that is what I do. However, the reality is that we're not all that good at fighting for the user, and we oftentimes blame the user for our security problems. And it's very difficult to see what we can do to work with the user to harden the human attack surface, right? I fight for the user, but how do we fight with the user? How do we see where the user is struggling, see where they are excelling, and engage them in our security problem? How do we create effectively a better model for security? So with that in mind, I set out to create a model for usability. I set out to rethink how we can harden the human attack surface. That's what I'm going to share with you today. And this is very much a work in progress. So I welcome any feedback in chat, any feedback in comments, any feedback afterwards. I'm always willing to discuss, hop on a WebEx and have a meeting, whatever you like. But I started thinking about the fact that we effectively build systems, right? We build systems either in conjunction with the IT folks, in conjunction with the developer folks, or we security people build systems that are an overlay on top of IT and applications that direct people to do what we want them to do. And when we think about the path that people are taking, the path that they take over the systems that we make, we can look at both the path and the choices. And from a path perspective, it's things like how many steps are we asking them to take? And we know the more steps, the more likely they are to quit. Interesting too, and I'll get back to this later on the talk, interestingly enough, we can even pinpoint how many steps it takes to get an adversary to quit. But we'll get back to that. We can think about the familiarity of each step. Is this something that I'm comfortable with? Am I used to it? Have I seen it before? We can think about any friction moving from step to step. Now I go from here to there. Is that an easy to take step, or is there a lot of friction? In terms of choices, it's something comparable. How many choices are we asking them to make? How predictable is each choice? If I click yes, and am I able to get in? Or if I click yes, am I suddenly blocked? And if so, do I have any data or any information to know what I need to do next? And how much thinking do I need to do to actually make each choice? What's the cognitive load? So very broadly, this is the model I've been working under, and I've been collecting some research on each one of these items, and I'm going to walk through today applying this model to harden our human attack surface. If you are interested in the science, feel free to go to this link. Either use the QR code, or if you don't trust me, the link's down below. And as I mentioned, I've been looking at the articles and the research behind choice selection, behind pathing, behind wayfinding, and I've been reviewing those. I'm going to review some of those in the session today. Any article that I mention is going to be found on this page, and as I continue to add things, I'll be maintaining this as a living document. And if you're like, hey, Wolf, did you not know about, please do let me know those things so that I can add it and look into it. All right, let me give an example of a very, very common path. Person's at work, they open up their Outlook, they're prompted to log in. All right, so they put in their username and password, and there's multi-factor enabled, so they've got to fulfill their multi-factor, and then they're just going through, right? I'm reading my email, I'm responding, I'm banging out to-dos like you wouldn't believe. Suddenly one of those is a fish, and that fish hopefully does not get me. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And along the way, if it does or doesn't, I need to report that and engage the security team. Very common workflow, right? Very common set of steps. Now, there's certain security inherent in this. There's a username and password, oftentimes a very common basic security control. There is, however, that username and password is communicated back to Outlook, whatever protocols are in place, wherever that username and password is stored, hopefully in Active Directory or something comparable. There's the multi-factor. What is the multi-factor in place? Is it a push on a phone? Is it an SMS text? Maybe there is no multi-factor, which would be even worse. Emails themselves, I can't do anything about that. I wish I could. If anyone has an idea, let me know. I know I've always been buried by emails. But then the fish itself, right? We can teach the person how to recognize fishes. Maybe we've done a phishing exercise before. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the reporting process. Is it a button within the Outlook experience? Is it forwarding on the email? Am I slacking someone? Am I hitting someone up over chat? So there's a number of different steps involved in this. To map out this very simple workflow, we can use process analysis. Very common if you're doing a standard like PCI, where you've got to have that analysis in place, or if you've done business continuity and disaster recovery, we can use the BIA process to map out the process. From a UI UX perspective, I'm a big fan of journey mapping or behavior mapping. Let's map out that journey, and let's look at each one of those steps and have some thought on how the user feels in that step, how easy it is, those sort of things. And if we want to think about it from the perspective of them getting lost, specifically if we think about them getting lost in the reporting process when a phish does occur, we can look at the science of wayfinding. The ability to navigate a complex set of prompts to reach some sort of goal. So there's a number of different tools that we can apply, and a lot of these can be pulled from UI UX, which is certainly a very ripe area to collaborate with from a security perspective. As we think about those steps, there's a couple things I want to bring out. One is familiarity. If it's very familiar to perform a step, it's very easy to accomplish it. You can even build up muscle memory. So familiarity from a multi-factor perspective might be having a consistent multi-factor, so that you're not flopping between them. In my last role, we had like 4 different multi-factor tools, and it's because we were doing consulting, so sometimes I'd use this one or that one, and sometimes the buttons were flipped, sometimes there were no buttons and I had to enter a code, all those sort of things. So familiarity is key. Familiarity also would come into play with the password. Maybe we're using a single sign-on solution. Hopefully we're not using like one of 191 different passwords, which is the average that a workforce has, a workforce person. There's nudges. How can we nudge someone to complete a step? And the science of nudging is, in and of itself, fascinating. How do we create the environment to nudge a person to complete those steps? There's also a thing called sludge. And what sludge is the opposite of nudge. What factors exist in the environment that would prevent someone from taking a step? So from the familiarity perspective, when work looks like work gets done. One of the most important things when adding security to a process is to make sure that that security task is executed within the work itself. So back to our hypothetical, very simple process, that could be the report button is right within Outlook, right? It's the way we're used to work being done. More broadly, this applies to a DevOps environment. So when we're thinking about DevOps security, one of the strongest ways that people have been able to inject security in those processes is by using DevOps tools that work within the CI/CD pipeline, right? So using tools that are executed just like any part of the build process. So familiarity becomes incredibly important when thinking through the steps and thinking about how we're going to add demands on our users. Sludge is the other thing that I mentioned. Nudges and sludges go hand in hand, but I think we've got more sludge in our world than we've got nudges. So sludge is when people face a high level of friction that obstructs their work getting done. So a good example of this might be, in our very simple example, if they can't get a hold of their multi-factor, if they forgot their password, if there is no easy way to report a phish, those types of things. There was some great research that was done that's available to build a dashboard to help organizations recognize the sludge. So we oftentimes think about measuring compliance rates. How often is our end users fulfilling a particular task? But we don't usually think through the exceptions. We don't usually think through getting metrics on how often they fail to complete it, or how often they work around it, how often they disable things. There was one security capability I was involved with was rolling out DLP to the endpoints. And it was really quite fascinating because we rolled it out, everything looked good, and then within a month, give or take, users started disabling it, uninstalling it. There was, shadow IT comms going around about, here's how you block that agent in case it's slowing you down. And we were able to, by going back at the 6-month mark and re-inventorying, get an idea of how many machines had the agent on versus how many machines still had the agent on at that point in time. That was a really good indicator of sludge, right? Of the fact that this agent was getting in the way of work, and therefore we had to act on it. So an insight here is that people break the rules, and as we all know, but when people break the rules, they're actually communicating to us about a problem in how we've set up the security. Oftentimes they think about it as, the people are irrational, or they're just not doing what they need to do, PEPCAC. The reality is that when we have insight into where people are bypassing or not following these controls, it's incredibly useful insight because it allows us to figure out where we're injecting more friction or we're injecting sludge without even being aware of it. Another good example of this was identity and access management. There's an automotive company that I worked with. They had an IAM program, and their IAM program did onboarding and whatnot. What they looked at as a key performance indicator was the percentage of IDs, percentage of people, right, with user IDs, that were onboarded through the normal process and the percentage of IDs that were offboarded through the normal process. So they had the ability to find out where people were bypassing the onboarding process. They had the ability to find out where people were neglecting to complete the offboarding process. And of course, both ends of those inject risk, right? If you're bypassing your normal process to onboard people, that means they're probably getting more permissions they need to. They're probably over provisioned. If they're not being disabled in a timely fashion, and they're left in a bad spot, well, now we've got risk of people logging in remotely and doing things wrong. So they used the metric of adherence to the policy as their KPI, and then they drilled into why people were doing this and adjusted their processes to address the type of friction that was being incurred. Took too long to onboard people. All right, we can do RBAC. Took too long to offboard people. Well, we can figure that out as well. So it's a really interesting insight to adjust your design of your security capability based on that feedback. All right, now let's think about choices. One of the key things is making the secure choice the easy one. I love this particular design because waste will, go in the right size shape based on if it's recyclable or based on whether or not it's just plain old garbage. And that allows this particular, waste control to drive a certain set of behaviors. In much the same way, when we think about choices, we need to think about what the smart default is. In the multi-factor world, maybe that is a smart default around the factors that are available. Defaults and choices are incredibly important. We like to think in security that it's going to play out like this, right? Our users are going to see their control, and maybe they'll try and bypass it because they're trying to get to where they want to go. They're trying to complete their path. So maybe they'll try and bypass it, and then maybe they're like, no, I can't do it, and they'll eventually give up. and in a way, we won because now we've got compliance to that control. The reality is, from a usability perspective, when we do not have a good handle on the path and the steps and the choices and the decisions, the users just will walk right through it, right? They work around us, and that incurs additional risk. Good examples of this include maybe I could get into my email, or I don't like my corporate email. So what do? I set up a forwarding rule and I send it out to Gmail, and I work from there. So we need to be very conscientious about the demands we make in the users. And this is another aspect of human psychology. Plenty of studies have shown this, that the more constrained a person is, oftentimes that leads to being more creative. And as we know, creative users are dangerous users. One of the security incidents I was involved with in the past few years occurred because constraints on getting access to files. So we had a multi-factor that was very difficult to use. We had a VPN client that was interfering with other VPN clients. We were mapping files over CIFS, so using the netuse command and the SMB protocol. And just the performance was terrible. The entire experience was terrible. And because of all those constraints, meant to keep sensitive data in a sensitive location. Because of all those constraints, the user population was like, well, I could just copy the files out and use them in another location. And of course, that ended up completely bypassing the security, and now meant the files were not in a secure location, hence causing a security incident. I think a really good example of choices and paths leading to better security was the introduction of Apple Touch ID. So prior to Apple Touch ID, no one liked their phones. I think Apple had the number lower than 20%. Unless you had to, you weren't going to lock your phone. And then Touch ID comes out, 2015. And when they design Touch ID, what do? They look at how people use their phones. You pick up your phone, you hit the home button, you go home and open up your apps. Wake up in the morning, first thing you do, you grab your phone, you hit the home button, you go to your apps. So on that path, that's where they put the touch sensor, right? That's where they put the biometric. So you hit the home button, and now that hitting the home button is what authenticates you. Really a stroke of brilliance, unappreciated stroke of brilliance. The other thing was they used smart defaults. So it prompted by default to turn on Touch ID. And within a year of this rolling out, the lock screens had jumped to over 80%. Really, really good use of that factor. Or rather, the model. All right, so this leads me to the following thought. If it is security versus usability, which so many people say, oh, we're in a security versus usability situation. If it is security versus usability, I would argue we're doing it wrong. Because it becomes security versus usability when we don't have insight into that usability. I don't believe, and it's not been my experience, that people will not do secure behaviors if they are easy to do, if they're familiar, if they don't have to think about it too much. It's going to happen. It becomes security versus usability when we're asked too much of users, when we inject controls thoughtlessly. And I'll come back to how to map this out with an adversary. But there's plenty of things that we can do, obviously, that are completely transparent to the user experience, which don't incur sludge and which don't cause some of these downstream issues. All right, let's think about this from an adversary perspective. Now let's think about how we can add security without even touching the users. What's very intriguing to me is we effectively play two games. And this isn't something we think about or talk about, but we've got the users and what they're motivated to do and what they're trying to accomplish. At the same time, we've got the adversaries and what they're motivated to do and what they're trying to accomplish. And we're building features and functionality. And hopefully that feature and functionality is only for the users. But as we know, the features and functionality oftentimes is misused. As a matter of fact, I oftentimes say that the features we give our users are effectively the exploits we're giving our attackers. And building the path for the users, we create a path for the adversaries. A really good example of this was the telephone fraud. It's mostly died down, but for the past couple years, we've seen this in a number of different cases. You'd have a customer site, and the customer site allows you to register, right? You put your username in, you put your password, you say who you are, and allows you to say, okay, I want you to SMS message me. So you go through that whole process. No problem. And from a organization perspective, wanting to keep our users happy, especially if those users are customers, you want to make that process of signing up as easy as possible, right? Make it as easy as possible, spend as much time to make sure that that sign-up feature works flawlessly. They can put their phone number in, they can do whatever they need to do. Now, at some point in time, adversaries recognize, well, wait a minute, if I want to make a few bucks, if I want to use this process, wait a minute, I could, in theory, register and tie that telephone number to a paid number, right? So that it's calling a 900 number or whatever. And when I register now, that service makes the call out. When it makes the call out, that call ends up doing a chargeback, and it's a great way to, from an adversary perspective, collect a bunch of money. We saw this get weaponized en masse in a number of different locations. I had a number of different conversations about it, where there would be a bot and it would register hundreds of thousands of accounts and just keep dialing, driving up the money. So we created a very simple feature, and in creating that feature, it ended up resulting in an exploit that the attackers could leverage. And that's the name of the game, right? We played this game consistently every single time. What's interesting is that as we make moves on both sides of the board, some moves will affect the adversary, some moves will affect the user, some moves will affect both. But effectively, oftentimes it's the same move, which really complicates the situation from game theory. It does lead you to think through that exact same model, though, and think about how it would apply to the adversary. How do we add additional steps? How do we make the choices more obscure? It's a little bit outside of the topic for today, but it's certainly something to think about. I would argue that good security is applied along the paths and choices both users and adversaries make. And by knowing what those paths are and thinking through what they are and putting security along that path, we can make a more informed decision as to whether or not that security control is going to directly impact the user or not. So when we apply this model from a workforce perspective, I mentioned behavior journey maps as a way to get our handle around it. We can use control frameworks, rather important from an audit perspective. I'll come back to audit in a little bit, but rather important to use a standard framework to anchor our controls on. Our goal is to reduce the number of steps. Our goal is to reduce the choices. We want to simplify the process. We want to clarify our communications so that the person between the chair and keyboard knows what they need to do. By contrast, from a criminal perspective, we're going to use threat modeling. We're going to look at what tactics are going to use, oftentimes from the Mitre ATT&CK framework. Our goal is to increase steps. Our goal is to increase choices. We want to complicate the process for them, and we want to confound the attacker. Ideally, we want to make one move in our environment, adding one control, reducing vulnerabilities, doing multi-factor, scanning, doing network segmentation. One move that addresses both the criminal and the workforce, simplifying the one and confounding the other. Now you may wonder, how many steps do we need to put in place before the criminals get caught? It's a question we've long wondered. It's a thing that many people have looked at from a threat modeling perspective. I was really intrigued back to the Verizon Data Breach Report with this chart from 2019. They did not do this chart in 2021, so I don't have current data. But I think as a guidepost, it's informative. What you see is the percentage of attack success going down with the number of steps. As a matter of fact, in the 2019 data set, you could cut the success in half by increasing the number of steps the attacker had to take to 10. And once you got to 15 or more steps, it was effectively 0%. Why? Because at that point in time, either the adversary is getting exhausted and going to another target, or the adversary is making so much noise that they're easy to detect and can be circumvented in the environment, right? We want to confound the attacker and move them into a place where they're setting off enough sensors, enough alerts that our SOC can investigate and get them out of the environment. So back to security versus usability. Certainly we don't want to necessarily introduce security which stops the users. Will I do it? 100% if that's the only way to do it. There are certain times where we need to stop the users, right? Either because they're I'll give you a really good example. Application whitelisting is a great example here. We may want to stop the user from running any malicious code, or we may want to stop the user from running anything other than the application the organization approves of. Now that's going to incur a cultural cost. We're going to have a hit on that, but sometimes that's the right choice. We probably don't want to introduce security that slows the user, unless there's a really strong benefit in terms of the adversary. Security that's invisible to the user is all over the place, and something we oftentimes don't think through, right? Even if you go back to the password, with the very first password being 6 decades ago, and the very first breach being shortly thereafter, every single move we've made with the password has been on one or two axes, either on the user, slowing them down or making them work harder, or on the machine. What are some of the things we've done on the machine that's invisible to the user? Well, we've encrypted the password. Then people started using, algorithms to break it. So what do? We started hashing the password, and then they started using rainbow tables. So we hashed it with salt. We made sure the passwords were stored in a secure location, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different things that we can do that's invisible to the user. So we need to think through what those are and make sure that they're obviously directly on the path the adversary is taking. There is occasionally security that can speed up the user. If you have any stories about security speeding up the user, I would love to hear it. Usually what that looks like is we're putting in place controls that remove some of the existing security complexity. So for example, moving to a single sign-on solution, or adopting a password manager to continue on this password example of a security control. Other ways that we could speed up the users are automatic deployments and allowing them to use mobile device management and allowing them to connect without a VPN, instead enforcing MTLS or microtunnels. There's a number of different things we can do on that side. Of course, those usually win us points. So we're trying to think through, like a bank account, spending where we need to in terms of stopping, and earning wherever we can in terms of speeding up. That's the way we balance out securing from a usability perspective and security from a defensibility perspective. All right, let's now think about how to apply this program and how to troubleshoot errors. I go way back in IT, and some of my early days of programming were good old basic, right? So you'd fire up a computer, you'd boot in, and you'd run your basic code, and almost always we would get syntax errors. Always. You would just keep typing until you figured out what that syntax error was. What's interesting to me is we think about a program where we're writing code as being fundamentally the developer's problem when we get a syntax error. But we don't necessarily think about a security awareness program as being the program creator's problem when we get error. You know what I'm saying? We're very ready to blame the user. We are not necessarily as ready to blame the system. So I want to think through some of those syntax errors, and I want to really own that from our perspective. I want to make sure that we are owning what goes on so that we can troubleshoot them and so we can correct them, instead of saying problem is between the keyboard and chair and not actually moving forward. There's a great paper on this about all the different ways that security errors can backfire. I'm going to highlight a couple in this section. But certainly there's a number of common ways that things go wrong, from backfiring to treatment being offset by other behaviors, and so on. When we do get an error, when something does go wrong, does not go as expected, there's a good troubleshooting process that I like to follow. This is from Spencer Greenberg. I first saw it with Fernando Montenegro at Converge Detroit, and it breaks things down into 4 categories. The first one being ignorance, and we'll talk about ignorance next. Irrationality, in terms of, well, what's the person doing? Why are they behaving the way they are? Incentives, specifically incentives mismatch. And then investments. Where do we need to apply better investments in people or technology to resolve the problem? So from an investment perspective, you may look at a security problem and say, well, the reason why we're not able to patch our systems fast enough is our IT, patch and vulnerability management team needs another person. Again, I've been collecting papers that tie back to these and books that are available off of this link if you want to see some of the underlying research, including the papers I've already mentioned. Let's look first at ignorance. Ignorance is predominantly the way we address these problems. Oh, someone didn't know what to do. They must be ignorant. We'll just give them security awareness training. It was a study done by ISF in 2020 that found, no surprise to anyone who's run an awareness program, that actually less than 15% of users change their behavior following awareness training. It really isn't effective just to do awareness. We also see the same pattern in other areas, in driving, in complying with doctor's orders, in voting as well. There was some great research done in the US about voting awareness, where they're measured the results of making sure someone was aware there was going to be an election. Needless to say, the results was basically nothing. Just being aware of it did not change anything. They found that most of the results came from asking for a plan, having positive peer pressure, and making the vote part of your user identity. We can change and funnel the same thinking into our security program. One thing is, when we think about peer pressure, is leveraging a security champion, right? A security champion, as I'm using the term here, is someone within the business unit who understands security, who cares about security, who provides peer support, peer pressure, as was mentioned earlier, and works to turn any planned control into action. In terms of identity, there's a lot of different ways to do this. In the DevOps space, I'm a big fan back in the day of Rugged and Rugged Manifesto, which was effectively looking at security as an identity challenge and getting people to change and view writing secure code as writing rugged code as being part of their identity. So there's some great things we can do there. Irrationality is interesting in terms of troubleshooting. We usually think people just are irrational. Well, in a way, they can be. It's not uncommon, back to the syntax errors of behavior change, for there to be backfiring. In my home state of Michigan, the United States, we put up signs that showed how many deaths there were on a particular stretch of highway in a particular year. The idea was that people would see that and would change their behavior. They did, but in the wrong direction. They saw that, and then they were taking more risks, and therefore the numbers of deaths in the highway actually increased. We can see some of the similar things happening in information security. Back to MFA as the example we've been talking about here. You give someone MFA, it's not uncommon for people to be a little more risky with phishing because they presume that they're protected. Treatment can be offset violator behavior. That was another syntax error I mentioned. I had one example where a gentleman brought a computer into the network that was infected, and that was the cause of a breach. And I asked him, why did you bring this computer that was infected into our secure network? And his response was, well, where else would I take it? It's the place that's the most secure. So we can see behavior causing downstream issues. And by starting to watch these behavior trends, we can build a better intuition as to what happens. There's other things to think about, back to being constrained in terms of users. A good study from 2015 looked at the sense of control. And the more control users feel, the better their behavior is in terms of risk. The less control they feel, the more risk they take. So keep that in mind next time we lock down an endpoint. It's very interesting to see the amount of security issues actually jump up on a lockdown endpoint as people take greater risks. Also, in terms of the choices that people make, the decisions, there's a lot of research that's been done that shows the more anxious a user feels, if they feel that they're going to be punished, if they feel that they've done something wrong, the more anxious they feel, the worse their decisions are in general, and certainly in security. I'm not going to go too far in incentives and investments. A lot of our incentives are simply getting out of the way, which doesn't seem to be a very good one. And investments, I already mentioned, is oftentimes about partnering with other folks to increase tools and increase people. Broadly, incentives and investments are benefits, and I would argue that ignorance and irrationality are part of the behaviors. If you think about whatever behavior we're trying to do, we want to reduce barriers, reduce the ignorance side of things, reduce the irrationality side of things, reduce the sludge, reduce anything that's getting in the way. And we want to try and find and amplify those benefits. It's critical for making behavior changes. Now, you may ask, hey, what are the barriers? Or where are the benefits? And what benefits are going to matter in our organization? I mean, is it a $25 gift card? Is it saying thank you? What are they? Almost impossible to know as a security person. Almost impossible to know. Which is where the security advocate comes into play. Security advocate, as I'm using the term in this conversation, is a member of the security team. Their job is to understand the business unit. Their job is to understand the barriers that exist. Their job is to help fight sludge and security fatigue and connect the champions. So if you think about us on the left, and our job is to get to the people on the right, right? Our job is to go from point A to point B to get the security behavior into the hands of the right folks. What that looks like is having an advocate within a security function, communicating with a champion within the business function to go ahead and communicate security features and controls and requests down. Also, incredibly important, getting that information back in, right? Using the security advocate and champion program for making informed decisions by providing feedback that we would not otherwise know. So to contextualize this and show an example of how and where we would place controls, let's look at phishing and stolen creds, back to my example process earlier. And again, this is from the Verizon Data Breach Report. So we know what's happening, right? I open an email, I log in, I MFA, I go through my email, I get phished, and I report it. Well, on the password itself, we could use longer passwords, certainly. That's going to slow down users. Or we could use longer passwords and not have them rotate. Or we could get off passwords altogether and use something like passwordless with a 502 standard, where you're using biometrics. So each one of those steps are getting easier on the user while still keeping the pressure on the adversary. On the multi-factor, we can go from entering a code to using push, from using push to having a security token. There's a number of different ways that we can add stronger security there. Again, simplifying the user experience. On the phishing side, well, we can look at better controls before it gets in the inbox. We can look at better ways of cleaning it up. I already mentioned the reporting side, making sure that we've got ease of reporting, buttons to alert on it, what have you. And if it does get compromised, if the adversary does get that, we can also think through the earlier controls. So if a password is in the wind and you have multi-factor, is it as important? Or if a password is in the wind and you have multi-factor and they're able to phish multi-factor, do we have an additional control like device identity? So not only do you have to do multi-factor, but also be on your device. That would confound the attacker. Do we have the ability to rotate passwords when we notice the password spray is occurring? You notice what I did not say was let's do phishing exercises. I am very leery of phishing exercises when viewed from a psychological lens, especially exercises that purport to be about a bonus or protecting your time off, especially things that go after safety or psychological needs. Why? Because that causes users to not engage with us. It damages the relationships with the champions. It pushes the program backwards. So fundamentally, as we think through this model, what we want to do is focus on usability to reduce friction and reduce effort, and defensibility to increase friction and increase effort. I walked through the path today and I showed where to do that along those steps. Now, those are just two of the four abilities, right? It's usability and defensibility. Outside the scope of what we have time today, there's also manageability. How easy is this to manage and support? Auditability, how well aligned are we with standards and whatnot? It creates a significantly large body of work, but we can think through this model and apply it to all four abilities to really deliver good security. When I realized that really was a mind-blown moment, I'm like, wait a minute, what else can we think through? What else can we do? And that's led me on to a current initiative where I'm effectively writing 100 different tips, approaches, things that I've learned from other designers outside of security that apply this model and allow us to think through how we go about security at this level. So feel free to see that if you're interested. Those are a little bit more outside the realm of security, but it all ties together in my mind. You know, we've been thinking about computers and thinking about security for a very long time now. And you know, this idea that people ultimately decide our security posture has led many to believe that it is PEPGAC. It is the problem, but I would also argue it is the solution. But if we just think about that keyboard and that mouse for just a minute, right? Just the chair and the keyboard itself. In the early days when computers were rolling out, there was research done because people started to suffer, right? People were sitting for long times. People were working on VDTs or computer monitors, and people were complaining. There's a great article, by the way, in Vice about this called How the Personal Computer Broke the Human Body. And when they analyzed it, when they researched it, it's not going to surprise anyone. The problems were predominantly around eye strain, around wrist strain, around back strain. The problem was literally the keyboard, literally the chair, literally the monitor. And you know, I'm not going to lie, I've had all these problems myself, right? I've worn a hand brace. I've had to get massages to get my back adjusted. And what have we done? What have we done since that study in the 80s? Well, we've had a revolution around human factors and ergonomics. We've adopted better keyboards, better mice, better monitors. We've adopted standing desks. We don't blame the person for eye strain and back strain. We adjust their environment. And yet, 6 decades after the password, 4 decades after that study into human strain on the body, and yet today we continue to blame people for security incidents. I would argue that security must catch up with human factors. We are at a moment where we need to press the reset on how we are addressing security so that we provide a more usable experience, so we provide a more humane experience, so that we take a human-centric approach to address these issues. The solution can be between the keyboard and the chair if we have a better model. Thank you very much for joining me today. Good luck and enjoy the rest of this conference.